Good morning, everyone. Glad you made it here to the Capitol. My name is Jim Schowalter, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. With me, the person who needs no introduction, Dr. Tom Stinson, and State Budget Director Margaret Kelly. We're pleased to bring you the February forecast and updated financial issues. Last December, we anticipated improvements in the state's economy and budget picture. Since then, little has really changed, and the state is continuing to go on a holding pattern around some of those previous estimates. Today's forecast really does little to change this. Some small revenue increases, some small spending decreases add about a 1% improvement to our forecast. That anticipated $323 million balance does not stick around long. It immediately goes to replenish the state's budget reserve and then start to repay some of the school shifts for our K-12 education institutions. So we have some more good news to report today, but on the bottom line, we started with this forecast with a zero balance, and after we repay schools and replenish the rainy day fund, we have a zero balance again. Within that picture, there's a lot of different issues. We'll try to get to those, and we'll be looking forward to taking questions along the way as well. So let's go to the first tag board. As you see here, you'll see the forecast changes that we show in this forecast. About $93 million change in our revenues, about $230 million changes in our spending. Revenue picture, as you've been looking at the monthly collections, has been tracking pretty much along expected lines. GDP numbers have also been pretty much what we've expected. Correspondingly, you see very little change in the revenue side of the picture. On the spending, much of this change is in the Health and Human Services area. We'll talk in more detail about that, but much of it is about changes in programs and estimates for single adults. Other types of health care, other types of spending really have had very little change. When you combine those two factors, which both go to improve the budget picture for the state, we have a $323 million balance. By long-standing current law, that balance is immediately taken to replenish the rainy day fund, which was largely replenished last forecast. As a result, only $5 million is needed to get it back to the $653 million level. Added to the $350 million cash account, we're at about $1.3 billion, or about 3% of our overall spending and revenue picture. The remaining money goes back to school districts. $318 million will take us from a 60-40 payment shift to 64-3, 35-7. If you look at the next page, we start to talk about that statutory provision that is designed to make sure that the state fixes up and restores some of the one-time mechanisms that it has used in the past. Those mechanisms are stated in line 16A, and really make sure that we have budget reserves, make sure that we have our payments going on an appropriate schedule before we start showing money on the bottom line of the forecast. This money will also affect spending, and Margaret Kelly will talk about that a little bit more shortly. But really, this will result in new payments going out to school districts yet this March. More than $200 million will go out the door in March. More than $300 million will go out from the state to school districts yet this fiscal year. Overall, the picture is a positive one, but really steady and consistent with the picture that we discussed last December. There's a lot of issues in the economy, a lot of issues in tax collections, and we'll talk about those, and I'll bring up Dr. Stinson to address those.
Well, the Commissioner told you that there was only a small change in revenues. Revenues for the biennium are now forecast to be up $93 million, or about 0.3%. And the reason is that there was only a small change in the economic forecast. This graph tells the story. Now, most of you know how this works. I put up a graph, and there are two lines, and I tell you it's the difference between the two lines that represents the gap in revenues. It's either positive or negative. This time, only the sharp-eyed among you can see that there are two lines, that they're really very, very close. That's the point. There's just a very, very small change in revenues. The question is, why is there only a relatively small change in the economy? Some of you might ask, isn't the economy improving compared to where it was last November? And the answer is yes, it is. But of course that was in the forecast. And some of you also might ask, isn't the risk of recession down? And the answer to that is yes. Global Insight has reduced the probability of their recession scenario from 40% to 25%. But in the macro forecasting world, a reduction in the probability of a recession doesn't necessarily mean stronger growth in the baseline scenario. The bottom line is that the U.S. economy is looking better, but not very much better than was expected, and certainly it's not booming. It's still 2014 before jobs get back to their pre-recession levels. The question obviously is, what about Minnesota? How are we doing compared to the national numbers? And the answer is we're doing a little better than the U.S. statistics. Our unemployment rate, 5.7% in December versus the December U.S. rate of 8.5%, is 2.8 percentage points different, 2.8 percentage points lower. And historically, we've been somewhere around 1.4 percentage points on average lower. So this is a noticeable difference in our unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is falling faster. There's a section in the handout that we gave you that describes some of the improvements that we've seen in the unemployment rate. Wages are growing a little faster in the forecast, and in general, we expect the Minnesota economy to do just a little bit better than the U.S. average. If you turn to the next slide, here's the revenue slide, and there's really not much to note. The income tax, the sales tax were both up by small amounts, and the corporate income tax was down by a small amount. The income tax numbers actually include an extra $6 million for the additional day in 2012, the leap day. And I want to remind you that that is today, and so I want you to go out and spend money on taxable items, because this is kind of like the pledge for public television and public radio. You know, you've got to do it today. We won't make our goal if we don't get that spending today. So $6 million, that's all we ask for today. The other unusual thing that we have is that all other revenues are more than half of the change. This is all the small taxes and fees and lottery revenue and all those things that really don't amount to much compared to the individual income tax and the sales tax in there. There's, of course, the usual uncertainty. There's the sovereign debt problems. There's the potential for geopolitical shock, and particularly with Iran, and the fact that that's driving up oil prices and could continue to drive up oil prices. And there are concerns about the slowdown in the Chinese economy. But consumer confidence is going up. Consumer confidence was up noticeably, more than forecast in February, so that's good news. Generally, things look good. The economy appears to be strengthening, but last year at this time I told you the same story, that the economy appeared to be strengthening, and there were a whole lot of negative shocks. So this year there may be positive shocks. We may do a little better than forecast, but we're a little less optimistic than we were last year. The big unknown that we have is federal fiscal policy. There are big spending cuts and big tax increases already built in federal law. Those spending cuts, those tax increases would definitely slow the economy if they're left in place. But we don't know what Congress and the President will agree on for fiscal policy at the end of the year. Difficult decisions in Washington, D.C. at the end of 2012, they will certainly affect the Minnesota outlook for 2014 and 2015. But at this point, the economy appears to be positioned for growth in 2012.
I'm going to speak to the spending piece of this forecast. Almost 3/4 of the forecast gain, about $233 million, is from lowered spending November compared to February. And over 3/4 of the lowered spending, $180 million, is in the Health and Human Services area, specifically in our medical assistance program. The forecast change in the MA budget is primarily driven by enrollment and to a much smaller extent by lower costs. $108 million of the $180 million, almost 60% of the lowered MA spending, is due to lower enrollment in the MA early expansion group, eligibility group. You may recall that this was a state option of the Federal Affordable Care Act that Minnesota implemented a year ago in March 1st of 2011. It's for single adults below 75% of federal poverty guideline. Since we first forecasted this program, enrollment for this group has been revised downward by 16% since last February, about 5% in the November forecast and another 9% in this forecast. So that's a significant change in any one eligibility group, and we typically don't see changes of that magnitude in a forecast, but this is a new enrollment group, eligibility group, that we did not have a lot of experience with in February when we first forecasted it. So now we have almost 12 months of actual data, better experience with the program, and we are revising our projections forward accordingly. If we exclude this eligibility group, the MA forecast change from November to now is relatively modest, less than 1%, and more similar to the size of change that we see in a February forecast. The remaining spending changes in the MA forecast are in the largest eligibility groups, the families and children, where enrollment growth has been lowered also. It has slowed based on economic changes. This is a group that is most sensitive to the economy, and with the economy improving, enrollment tends to decline in this group. Elderly and disabled group, another very large category of MA spending. This reduction in the forecast is driven by lower costs in the fee-for-service area. A few more months of actual data compared to November, and we're not seeing the cost as we had projected earlier. That's the MA budget. If you go back up to the $30 million of lowered spending in K-12, this again is driven by slower enrollment in K-12 programs than we had previously projected in November. Less than a 0.1% change in per pupil counts. It's a very small change in enrollment, but it is driving down our forecasted growth and our forecasted projection for spending in this area. The other changes are relatively minor in this forecast. A little smaller aid payments due to property tax levies being lower than we had projected in November. Debt service being lower than we had projected in December, driven by capital loan repayments by school districts. Law that passed last session allowed them to repay principal only and not interest, and more school districts signed up for that than we had projected back in November, or end of session, or November. And all other spending in state government, minor technical adjustments there causing a slight upper. And so overall, a $230 million reduction in spending. But because we have a positive balance in our forecast, and as Commissioner mentioned, we are taking $318 million of the positive balance and beginning to repay our school shift, we will actually see changes in our actual spending compared to our forecast. So the K-12 education line, we will put an additional $318 million of spending there, and that negative 30 will change to a positive $288 million. Meaning the bottom line of the table will go from a negative 230 to a positive 88. So we'll be spending $88 million more bottom line this biennium than compared to our forecast because of buying back the K-12 shifts, beginning that process. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Commissioner Schowalter.
So, as you can tell, the aid payment shifts, we're starting to make some starting to make some progress on that, but there's still plenty of work to be done. The fiscal issues that are in front of the state aren't resolved with this forecast or the previous one, and will take quite a bit of effort to resolve. About $2.4 billion of aid payment shifts remain after this is done. We continue to monitor closely cash balances of the state, and will continue to have issues associated with making sure that we have liquidity in the state and looking at those projections going forward. And obviously the third issue that we're all very familiar with is the structural balance of the state. And this forecast really makes some relatively minor changes in that balance as well. Last forecast, we projected a $1.3 billion structural imbalance between in fiscal 14 and 15. That is reduced somewhat to $1.1 billion in that same period. Result of really using one-time resources in the current biennium for ongoing obligations. That $1.1 billion gap does not include the effects of inflation. If you included that, it would be another $1 billion on top of it. So certainly we have our fiscal work ahead of us, but the good news is certainly that we are in a holding pattern, that we're certainly in a stable position, and that the economy is performing the way we would hope it would. Now comes the fun part for questions and answers. Happy to take any that you might have.
What's the greatest threat to derailing this recovery you see?
I would go to Tom on that one, because there's several different options that you could pick. But I think we're in a much stronger place. Just from my perspective, we're certainly in a much stronger place than we were even just a year ago, where there's some momentum. You look at the consumer confidence that's detailed in the detailed budget forecast book. You look at changes in manufacturing. You look at the jobs numbers and the unemployment numbers. There's actually some strength going on and some self-sustaining activity going on beyond external shocks.
Well, as Jim said, there are a lot of possibilities. One is geopolitical shock, something going on with Iran, both the shock to consumer confidence that hostilities with Iran would create, and the higher oil prices would cause the economy to be much weaker. Second is that there would be a messier than expected solution to the European sovereign debt problems. It looks like the European sovereign debt problems are being slowly worked out. They're not going to be solved overnight or anything like that, but it looks like they're going to be slowly worked out. But there are a lot of internal politics involved as well, and that could all fall apart. But the thing that people don't recognize, and most people would have recognized those two possibilities, is that we have substantial possibility for fiscal policy mistakes at the end of 2012. Under current law, there's going to be drag on the economy put into place that's roughly equivalent to that was the stimulus that was put into place in 2009. The expiration of the Bush tax cuts, the expiration of the payroll tax, the institution of the automatic spending cuts, and several other tax situations as well, extension of the AMT. All of those things are going to be a problem, and Global Insight has assumed that there's going to be some kind of grand bargain reached between the Congress and the President that puts the fiscal drag somewhere in between what would happen under current law and what we already have. But of course there's no guarantee, and differences in that delay in reaching agreement could create pretty substantial drag on the economy in 2013.
Dr. Stinson, because this is a bonding session, how does this revenue forecast affect the state's ability to borrow its debt capacity?
The Commissioner can address that more directly, but I think that it doesn't really affect it in any meaningful manner. We already have sufficient capacity.
What's our current capacity?
There's several different guidelines based upon this forecast. Guideline number one would show about a $1.9 billion authorized level. What people have been really managing off of is the 10-year rolling average. That's included in the forecast assumptions here, and that's $750 million.
Question about 14 and 15. my understanding is that we are no longer in our estimates of the outlook adding the school shift automatically back into those numbers. If we were to throw it all in, school shift plus inflation plus these numbers, is it accurate to say that we are really facing a problem in excess of $4 billion in 14 and 15?
Yeah, the four pieces that you're referring to, the structural deficit of $1.1 billion. Inflationary pressures aren't included in that, so there's some measure of impact that could be added to that. So you're at 2.1 with that. The remaining IOUs that the state has are significant. That includes the aid payment shift to school districts. It includes the property tax recognition shift as well. That total is about $2.4 billion. So if you rolled those all in and said you wanted to solve all that in the 2014 biennium, yeah, it would be more than $4 billion.
And how about, maybe Dr. Stinson, you always talk about Minnesota comparing to the rest of the country. We had many years of outperforming. We like to think we're above average. Can you do a comparison of Minnesota's economy now to the nation?
Yeah, I went through that a little bit already, but if you just look at the unemployment numbers, the unemployment rate numbers, in December, the U.S. unemployment rate was 8.5%. Minnesota's was 5.7%. We were 2.8 percentage points below the national average. Now, Minnesota is always below the national average, but we are not always 2.8% below the national average. And the income and the unemployment rate has come down more rapidly since 2009 than in Minnesota than nationally. So just looking at the unemployment rate, you'd say that Minnesota's economy is responding a little bit more rapidly. Well, on the jobs front, there's going to be news tomorrow on the jobs front, and so we don't know exactly what will happen, but the February numbers will come out and there will be a re-benchmarking of the prior data revisions, really. And we're expecting that there will be good news on that as well. So Minnesota's economy is doing better than the national average, but that's still not back to where we would like it to be.
Can you talk a little bit about differences from one segment of the state economy to another, ag, mining, manufacturing, whatever?
Minnesota's economy is actually kind of growing in lockstep overall. There isn't a favored sector or a highly favored sector and a highly troubled sector. Probably the sector with the most trouble and the most difficulty still is construction. Its employment in construction is way down compared to where it was. But even construction employment, we think, now this is all subject to data revisions tomorrow, but even the construction sector seems to have stabilized and maybe starting to move upward a little bit.
Any sense of why we're doing even better than usual in terms of outpacing national unemployment?
Part of it is California. California's a big state, a huge part of the national economy, and if California is doing poorly, you better be doing better than the national average because they drag the national average down. We're not doing that much better or even better than our surrounding states.
Could you return to the construction job situation? Do the construction jobs, the down economy for construction jobs, assume a $775 million bonding, or does it not assume that the bonding bill passes?
It really doesn't assume either. It just assumes that the economy kind of goes along its normal path, and whatever a quote mark normal path would yield in terms of bonding bill, that's in there.
So does that mean that if a bonding bill passes, it wouldn't have a significant impact on the number of construction workers employed?
No, it doesn't. Obviously, it's assuming a bonding bill of some sort going on in there. It's kind of the background to the forecast is that we would have normal actions, normal behavior, and not passing a bonding bill would not be considered to be normal behavior for this session.
Dr. Stinson, there's a lot of talk in this session among the lawmakers and the governor this session about, jobs, jobs, jobs. Is there anything that they can do, either side, this year that's going to boost the labor market in any meaningful way?
Well, a lot of you have heard my comments before, and that is that on the capital budget, a lot of the spending doesn't occur in the next year or the next 2 years. It takes a long time for it to occur. The place where spending can occur in the next year or the next 2 years is in asset preservation, maintenance of existing facilities and things like that, so that if you want to tailor the capital budget to providing short-term increases in employment, shifting the proportion that goes for asset preservation, making that a higher proportion would be one thing that could be done.
Just to follow up on that, with the tax credits that are being proposed, whether it's for hiring or, to cut the statewide business property tax, does that have any immediate impact on the job situation?
I don't believe that statewide a change in the statewide property tax would have any immediate impact on the job situation. Property taxes depend upon assessments and levies made in the year prior, and so what you'd have is, it'd be at least a year before you'd see anything that was having any impact, and probably the longer term. That's not to say that this might not be good for the long-term outlook, but what it does say is that it's not going to have an immediate impact on the job situation.
Commissioner, at what point is the money that you say is going out to schools in March committed? In other words, if legislators wanted to make a change in that law, when would they have to do it?
Next couple of weeks. About $200 million will be sent out in the month of March, starting on March 15th. So there's really a pretty short window. The statute basically appropriates this money, and the schedule of payments to school districts is already set, so mid-month.
And can you say once more how much after this will still be left to repay in the school shift?
Yeah, coming into this forecast, we estimated about $2.7 billion in aid payment and property tax recognition shifts were outstanding. With this forecast, we have a balance of about $2.4 billion in those payments. That doesn't mean that it's all new budgetary resources for schools. It's really helping their cash flow needs, helping them make sure that they can borrow less during the course of a year, but that is the amount that's still out there.
Given that, do you expect this is the last time you'll be coming before us with some slightly good news for at least the next 2 forecasts?
We certainly have a lot of aid payment shifts, a lot of things to deal with. So, yeah, it's going to be a while before we have a positive forecast balance, even if we have good news rolling forward for years to come, certainly months to come.
What's your deficit primarily based on? The deficit projection?
The out-year deficit is really a result of ongoing obligations for health care, for local aids and credits, for education, and the permanent revenues behind it aren't there. We were able to balance this year's budget, if you recall, with sizable one-time resources from the tobacco bonds, from the school shift. Those aren't there in 2014 and 15, but the obligations and the continued programming is. And so as a result, we have a structural balance that we're going to have to resolve.
Dr. Stinson, I once asked you a question about what would prime the pump, and you actually said a payroll tax cut would actually do it, and I think the Obama administration heard you and implemented it. But what would prime the pump to actually get us in the positive?
Well, first of all, we're in the positive. I mean, this is plus. We were plus 93, so, okay. So,
You're always so positive.
yeah. So we would have that. More of the same, I guess. I think the risk is this delicate balancing act that the President and the Congress are going to have to do in November after the election and December. And the balancing act is how much of the deficit do you cut so that you can have stronger long-term growth, as opposed to how much do you keep it so you can have stronger short-term growth.
Any other questions?
Yeah, on the school district payback, weren't a lot of the school districts forced to borrow money to make their budgets? In that case, I mean, is the state going to cover their borrowing costs? And wouldn't interest be part of their payback, or are they just out of luck?
No, the interest isn't part of the payback. Really what this does is just restores the traditional, or gets us closer to the traditional payment structure that the state has, recognizing most of the entitlement for K-12 education in the first year, less of it in the settlement in the second year. Currently it's at 60-40. We're bumping it up by a little over 4%, but there's certainly significant adjustments yet to get it back up to that 90-10 level. I think we're about done then. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and attention. All the details are online as usual, and if you have any questions, let us know.